Hey guys, welcome to another video for anatomy and physiology. And in this video we're looking at the spinal cord and we're taking a cross-sectional anatomy look at it. Basically what that means is that we're taking a horizontal cut, slice through the spinal cord, and we're taking a look at what it looks like on the inside. Essentially you're taking a look at two different types of nervous tissue. So the first one that we're looking at is the gray matter. Okay, so now of course it's not gray as you're looking at the slice. Now the reason for these two different types of colorations is because of the stain that they use. They use silver ions to stain this, so it kind of gives the gray matter a brownish color, and the white matter that amber light brown color or whitish color. So the gray matter has very little melanin. Okay, so remember melanin is the fatty tissue that surrounds that insulates nervous tissue, that makes it conduct its signal a lot faster. So this is essentially all like the thin parts of the axons. Okay, so there's very little myelin. I think I said melanin earlier. I meant to say myelin. There's a little bit of somas, dendrites, the proximal parts of the neurons. And this is the area, this is the location of neural integration. But basically what that means is that if you go back to the previous video when we were looking at the reflex arc, where the signals from the body, from the sensory organs like your touch receptors, pain receptors, what have you, they send a signal to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord it'll go, that signal gets integrated into the other signals, the efferent signals, that will then send the signal back to the muscle, causing it to contract or relax, inhibit, or what have you. So the integration part, this is kind of like the middleman. So remember, I use the analogy of a bus transfer. So this is the place where the signal kind of gets transferred from afferent to efferent. So again, this is the location for neural integration. And then we're looking at the white matter. Okay, this is kind of a pearly white, and again, remember it's because of the ions that they use in the staining. There's a pearly white appearance. This is where a lot of the myelin, okay, this is where a lot of the fatty tissue, the insulation occurs. And there are bundles of axons and the tracts. Now with the tracts, best way maybe I can describe this, and I'll get into it a little bit more in a few minutes, is this is the location. Remember, the spinal cord is a long tube, right? That goes into your, that's housed inside your vertebrae, and that long tube has tracts, has fibers. You know, our neighborhood right now is getting optic fiber from Google, right? So they're putting in wires to connect to have stronger internet. So with the nervous system, the spinal cord is it's the wiring, if you will, that connects the brain, the central nervous system, into the peripheral nervous system. So these tracks are kind of like optic fibers, if you will, or like a subway system, underneath. All right, and you can't really see that when you have a cross-sectional slice of the organ that you're looking at. So again, there's an abundance of myelin, so there's a lot of insulation here. So for fast signaling, there's bundles of axons, tracts. Okay, so this is the area where the signals will be sent from one location to another in the central nervous system. All right, so let's again look back at the cross section that we have here. Now, as you can see here, one of the obvious features that you see right up front is just looking at the appearance. Some say that it looks like a butterfly. I like to say this is more of a Honda H. There it is. There's a Honda H. It kind of looks like the Honda. Also, notice that the gray matter in the spinal cord is in the middle, on the inside, whereas the white matter is on the outside. This is actually opposite to the brain, where the gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. So something to keep in mind and not to get confused by later on. Okay. So now looking at the general anatomy, the appearance of what we're looking at here, let's look at some of the general the features that you see that you should recognize and know. So as I'm looking at this again, and I'm focusing on the gray matter here, so I'm looking at the Honda H, right? So this consists of the posterior or the dorsal horns. Okay, so remember, dorsal meaning the back. So that's one of the ways that you can see, you can locate which side is the posterior and the anterior. And there's actually a much easier way to locate the anterior and posterior of the spinal cord. So if you look at the bottom part there, you have what's called the anterior median fissure. Okay, and then on the posterior side, you have the posterior median sulcus. So remember that the fissure is going to be the bigger, the wider opening, whereas the sulcus is just the smaller inside cut there. Okay, So that's how you know which side is anterior and which side is posterior. So anterior median fissure, and then the posterior median sulcus. So again, on the posterior end, on the dorsal, you have the two horns that extend pretty much to the surface of the spinal cord, and then you have two thicker anterior or ventral horns. Okay, and they extend anterolateral. And so the posterior horns are where you're going to get the afferent signaling, okay, and then the integration inside the gray matter itself. And then on the anterior horns is where you'll get the efferent signaling going back to the somatic centers. So that's where the muscles will actually move and what have you. So now connecting the left and the right lobes, if you will, you have what's called the gray commissure. So in the middle of the gray commissure, you have the central canal. And this is where the spinal fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, is actually coming from. And there's a direct connection to this all the way up into the brain, to the base of the brain, or inside the brain actually, into the fourth ventricle, where the cerebrospinal fluid is being made. So again, something to keep in mind as far as these horns. Let me give you a better view, a little bit more perspective on this. So again, just trying to grab some perspective on what you're looking at. So again, that transverse cut of the spinal cord. So now we're kind of zooming out and getting a better overhead look, if you will, of the structure that you're looking at, the cross section of what you're looking at. So keep in mind with the ventral root, right? So the ventral root on the front side, the anterior side, those ventral horns, as they kind of protrude out laterally, they eventually come out. They eventually come out and go into what's called the ventral roots of the spinal cord, okay, or of the spinal nerves. So these are the ventral roots that eventually come out. And so moving our way up into the posterior side, right, the dorsal side, and again, the dorsal aspect pretty much comes out to the surface of the spinal cord, and then it goes into the dorsal roots, okay, the dorsal roots meaning on the posterior side. Right, so hopefully you're kind of getting to see what, you know, a broader perspective of what we've been talking about. So with the dorsal roots, this is where the afferent signaling comes in. Okay, this is the sensory input, and then inside the spinal cord with the gray matter is where you'll have the integration, the processing, and if you go back to the previous video when we talked about the reflex arc. Now, if it's a reflex, then it skips going up into the brain for processing, and it just goes into an interneuron in the spinal cord and just goes into the ventral roots itself. And this is the efferent, right? This is the efferent. So this is going to go into the somatic receptors, and this is going to cause the muscles to contract. Or if it's down in the, here, let me give you a bigger view. So if you're looking at the thoracic region, you know, this can go into, this is the nervous system that goes into the organs, you know, for hormone secretion, for digestion, whatever the case may be. So anyways, so hopefully again this gives you a broader perspective of the cross section that we're looking at, and how the nervous system goes from the gray matter, and then it expands out of the spinal cord and into the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's go back and let's take that transverse cut and look again, finish up on our cross section for the spinal cord. Okay, so something that's not mentioned here is, and not mentioned or not seen here, is the lateral horn. For certain parts of the spinal cord, you have a lateral horn that protrudes out, the lateral aspect of the H of the gray matter, and this lateral horn protrudes out from T2, thoracic vertebrae 2, to the lumbar 1. Okay, that's the only place where you're going to see the lateral horn come out, and that's basically where you have the nerve fibers for the sympathetic nervous system. So this is kind of the part of the nervous system that controls like hormonal levels and what have you. So you're not going to have that throughout the entire spinal cord. So we're taking a look at the white matter now, and the white matter, again, like I mentioned before, so you have this long spinal cord, right? And so in that spinal cord, you have columns. You have, like I mentioned before, you can picture subway tubes that connect the entirety of that spinal cord. So a signal that will go from the toe will start out from the very bottom of the spinal cord all the way up to the top to the brain stem, where most where most originate or end up. And so these columns, there's very specific names for these sections here, and let's actually let's get into that. So these bundles of axons are called columns, and the red signifies or shows where you have the posterior column, and then you have the green with the lateral columns and the blue with the anterior columns. Now this is actually a very simplified look at what is actually happening here, because each of these columns, like for example the posterior column, these can be subdivided into in tracts or fasciculi. So there's individual. So for example, if I want to get to where I live to a very specific part of the city, then I'm going to take a very specific route. Okay, and we mentioned that before with the somatic reflexes in the previous video, that wherever the signal is coming from, it's going to take a specific route to get to its destination, and it takes a specific route also inside of the spinal cord. So a signal that comes from my toe is going to take one of these columns. It's going to take an ascending track, so that will be the ascending part of it. There's an ascending aspect to the column, and then there's also a descending track. Okay, so it's not a random. This isn't a random like open highway with no lanes, if you will. Like these highways have very specific lanes, very specific exits, and what have you. Okay, so it's a very structured, organized structure that we're looking at right here with the columns. So again, there's ascending tracks that send sensory information up the cord, and then there's descending tracks that conduct signals to the motor effector muscles that will cause movement on whatever you want. So many of these fibers have an origin or a destination at the brainstem. Okay, again, depending on whether it's an efferent or afferent signal, it's going to either end up with the afferent at the brainstem, or it'll begin as an efferent signal leaving the brainstem. So a lot of these signals that start off on one side of the body will actually what's called decussation. Decussation meaning that they will cross over. So as let's say I prick my right hand. Okay, I prick my right hand with a needle. That signal at some point in the spinal cord will cross over, and the signal will end up on the left side of the brain. Okay, so essentially the right side of the body is controlled by the left side of the brain, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And one of the ways that this is seen, decussation, is during a stroke. So if there's a stroke that happens on the right side of the brain, usually there'll be paralysis on the left side of the body. Or if there's a stroke on the left side of the brain, then the right side of the body will experience paralysis. And again, that's decussation. That's a crossover from left to right. Okay, and for the most part, they do cross over. And so whenever you have a signal that where its origin is opposite to its destination, that's called contralateral. Contralateral. But if the signal remains on the same side, then we call that ipsilateral. So that means it doesn't decussate. It stays the same. It doesn't cross over at some point in the spinal cord. Okay, well, that's going to do it for our video on the cross-section anatomy for the spinal cord. And I hope you learned something new. Thanks for listening, and good luck in your studying.